Welcome to another episode of National Divorce Talk Raw, where we give you the information the mainstream media just doesn't want to make sure you're aware of. We're going to be talking today about how we are weeks away, days away from the midterm elections. And many newspapers on the left and on the right are talking about how democracy is failing and they have no faith in America or their fellow Americans. Lots of surveys, lots of newspapers, mainstream publications, days before midterms elections saying, I don't trust my fellow Americans and I think America's going down. Bad, horrible sign. Usually elections get people pumped up and they're excited and they want to see change and they believe that the future can be possible. All these surveys and polls and articles are saying everybody's pessimistic in America, both left and the right, and they have no faith in each other, and they have no faith in America. Pretty bad. Almost like it's a sinking ship, and those with half a brain should be looking at ways to get off the sinking ship. We'll cover all that in just a second, but first, stay tuned. We're going to do this a little bit in reverse. I'm going to show you the sources first, and then I'll cover what they mean because it gets a little bit wordy, and I want to make sure everybody can follow along. So I'm going to show you the sources first, and then we will go into detail of what all those sources said. All right, share your screen. Let's get started on our adventure. So the first one is from the New York Times. I know, paywall. Democratic norms are facing historic test. Many Americans doubt the result of the 2020 election. Many Americans doubt the results of the 2020 election, and extremism, globalism, democratic norms are facing a historic test. That came out August 2nd, 2022, New York Times. Here's another New York Times article. Threats to democracy. Key threats to democracy. Based upon a new poll, we're going to show you that poll in a minute. Democratic norms are facing a historic test. New threats to democracy. We're also going to cover this article by How Americans View Trust, Facts, and Democracy Today, February 19th, 2020, by Pew Global Research. We will also be talking about this article by The Atlantic. Can democracies exist without liberalism? That came out October 19th, 2022. Here's an article by Washington Post. Americans agree democracy is at risk. They just disagree on vehemently why. So Americans agree democracy is at risk. They do disagree on why. I know, paywall, sorry. So you can see the article. Let me show you the date so you can figure out. That's October 18th, 2020. I don't know if you can see that one more time. There you go. And finally, this, which came out October 25th, 2022. Let me just show you this in full. I know it's on Fox News, but it's Fox News clip from MSNBC. No, they did not take the clip out of context. Yes, it's exactly what MSNBC is talking about, not taken out of context. Let's take a look at what they're talking about.
The threats to our elections in, 2.5 weeks are so pervasive and they're so dire and they include violence. I mean, do you think it's time to ask for friends and allies to come over and help us monitor our elections? We used to do that in other burgeoning and threatened democracies.
Mexico.
That's right. So MSNBC was saying, in the past, American democracies used to be stable. And Americans would go overseas to third world countries that were not stable democracies and observe their elections to make sure the elections were free and fair. Now democracy in America is so unstable, according to MSNBC, perhaps we need those third world countries to send advisors to us, whereas in the past we would send advisors to them. So used to be America was a shining beacon of democracy. Third world countries were unstable democracies. America would send advisors to them. Now, literally on mainstream TV, they're saying we have so little faith in American democracy. We think international observers should come and witness our elections to make sure they're fair here. So the amount of faith that Americans had in third world countries, democracies in the 80s, 90s, and 70s is the amount of faith Americans have in their own democracy today, according to MSNBC. That should shock the hell out of you that they actually said that on TV. Can't be made bigger. I know Fox picked up on that, but it's true. They said it, and that should shock you. That MSNBC, the flagship of the left, is saying, we have so little faith in American democracy, maybe we should view ourselves as a third world country that needs international observers. Additionally, most of those articles that I showed you, Washington Post, New York Times, Atlantic, are talking about a particular poll that came out recently. Let me see if I can show you that. This is the poll itself. Came out October 14th to the 18th, NBC News survey. And if we ask people, is America headed on the right track? 20% say so. Is America headed on the wrong track? 71% of Americans say America's headed on the wrong track. 71% of Americans say, America, you're headed on the wrong track. I have another example. Let me see if I can pull this one up. I'm going to try to do this. There we go. Here's that same poll. Tabulated a little bit differently. Wrong track, 62%. Right track, 24%. So there are two different polls came out recently, right before the midterms, where 3/4 of Americans are saying America's on the wrong track. And less than 1/4 is saying America's on the right track. So, that's pretty bad. So you have a lot of articles talking about no faith in democracy. You have MSNBC saying we have as little faith in American democracy as we did in third world countries in the 80s. And you have this poll coming out from NBC News weeks before midterms, and it says 3/4 of Americans. That's all the conservatives and a huge chunk of liberals and Democrats believe America's on the wrong track. Bad news. All right, let's do the deep dive. Now that you saw all of those articles and references, I'm going to show you exactly what they said. So here's the New York Times. I know I couldn't show the article, but here was the key points. 71% of all voters believe that democracy is at risk, according to a recent poll by New York Times, Siena College, but only 7% identified that as the most important problem facing the country. Americans face more immediate concerns: the worst inflation in 40 years, the loss of federal abortion rights after 50 years. But another factor is dampening people's motivation to save America's representative system of government. Some have already lost faith in its ability to represent them. Our two-party system is all or nothing, Mr. Burden said. Either your party wins the White House or loses it, wins Congress or loses it. It makes feelings more intense, positively or negatively. In long rural stretches, hills and coulees between the hipster hangouts and the union halls of La Crosse and Eau Claire, Van Orden and Johnson campaign signs jostle with faded Trump-Pence placards. Mr. Pfaff, who noted that Democratic super PACs were not coming to his aid, said it would be pointless in any case for outsiders to ask local voters to reject Mr. Van Orden as a threat to the political establishment. We're all patriotic Americans. We know the difference between right and wrong, and what happened in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. on January 6th was wrong, he said. But the thing is, if somebody from the outside, somebody from the East Coast or West Coast starts talking about something like that, that's not how people want it. They're not going to hear that. So what they're talking about is the two-party system is losing faith by Americans. You have 3/4% of Americans believe America's falling apart, but only 7% can actually agree on what the main problem is. Think about that. 3/4 agree America's falling apart, but only less than 10% of Americans can come together to figure out what the main issue is. Everybody knows it's failing. Almost nobody can agree on anything to do to fix it. Bad sign. And they're talking about the division in America. And what they're saying is, look, January 6th was wrong. And people in the Midwest and South and the Rockies supported it. And if some liberal comes out and reminds them, they're going to tell them to shut up. So they're patriotic Americans, even though they sort of supported January 6th. But hey, if any liberal reminds them that was wrong, then they're going to not hear it. So if you're a liberal, you can't even remind people that there was an insurrection. That's how bad it is. full-on insurrection, storming the Capitol, first time since 1812 with the British storming the White House. You're a liberal. You can't even talk to a conservative about that. You can't even have a conversation with them about January 6th happened and it was bad. Period. End of story. And while 3/4 of Americans think America's going down, less than 10% can agree on what the problem is. If you can't agree on the problem, you can't fix it. Now let's take a look at what the Atlantic said. Also bad. If a country can have a democratic culture in 2006 and then not one in 2022, is it really a culture? Because a lot of people saying the democratic culture is eroded. The American norm is wholly unlike that of highly sectarian countries. People who vote Democratic can find themselves ruled by Republicans. And they accept this, unhappily perhaps, but acknowledge the duty of obedience and a common loyalty that is far more important than any electoral differences of opinion. Upon rereading this passage not long ago, I chuckled at the irony. For Scruton, the ability to be unhappy but still obliged when one's adversary wins an election is the precondition of democracy as we know it. In a sense, the other party, as lousy it might be, is still merely an opponent rather than the enemy to be vanquished. But according to this metric, the United States no longer meets a key prerequisite to democracy. The Atlantic magazine is a high profile policy magazine. Give me 1 second. Okay. We love quoting from the Atlantic magazine. It's a high profile policy magazine, covers international policy. So when they talk about America, they're not just coming from a insular domestic perspective of America. They're looking outside of America and at other countries and then comparing America to other countries. So when they make a statement like this, it has a lot of weight to it. The Atlantic magazine is now saying America no longer fits the conditions for a democracy. Why? Because people don't have faith in the elections. The fact is that you had Democrats deny an election in 2016 to 2018, saying it was the Russian government that did it. Every intelligence analyst agency came back and said Russia rigged absolutely no votes. Did they make posts to try to influence voters? Absolutely. Did they actually rig or switch any votes? Zero evidence. And yet for 2 years, you had liberals saying that. Then when the evidence came out, they didn't want to hear it. Then you have conservatives saying, we don't believe in Biden's election. Now that's a problem. Liberals hate conservatives for saying that, but I have yet to hear any liberal bring up, we kind of did the same thing for 2 years. There was no evidence and we never apologized. I know the other side's doing it. And so here's the Atlantic saying, when you have everybody discounting elections, you have one half of the country discount the election in 2016. And then in 2020, you have another half of the country discount the election. You don't have a country that stands by elections anymore. That means you don't have a democracy. And I'll remind you that MSNBC television clip we showed you, Americans have so little faith in America that mainstream TV is now saying we should maybe ask for the same advice that we used to give third world countries. Now let's take a look at what the Washington Post is also saying around this time. It's been clear for some time that Americans see the country's political system as endangered. Polling released this week by the New York Times and Siena College reinforces the point. 7 in 10 Americans believe America's headed down the wrong way. In fact, there's an unusual bipartisanship to the issue. 7 in 10 Democrats, Republicans, and independents all share the conclusion. So when we're talking about 3/4 of Americans think America's going down, it's not all Republicans because they hate Biden. It's everybody. That's what Washington Post, a liberal magazine, is saying. Here's what the Pew survey says. Our surveys have found that while Americans generally agree on democratic ideals and values that are important for the United States, for the most part, they see the country falling well short in living up to these ideals. That's from the Pew Global Trust. And then you also heard from the Washington Post that it's not just Republicans, it's Democrats and independents. And then you heard from MSNBC saying maybe we should think about ourselves as a third world banana republic that can't trust our own elections. And then you had the Atlantic saying, wow, America is no longer really a democracy, given that nobody really buys the results of the elections and abides by them. That was a prerequisite America had for 200 years, and now it's gone. These aren't my statements. These are high-profile mainstream sources. And the New York Times saying the same thing. 71% believe there's a problem. Only 7% can agree on the problem. All of that says we're doomed. This is not a democracy anymore. It doesn't function like a democracy anymore. And all of this is coming out weeks before midterms. These are horrible signs for the health of the American democracy, and more signs that the ship is sinking, and we need to get the hell out while we still can. That's it. See you next time.